We were putting together something on Louisiana, the usual material, the places everyone already knows, when we noticed a green exit sign on Interstate 55. It pointed to a town called Ruddick. Ruddick has not existed since 1915. That stopped us, so we kept pulling the thread. One name led to another. 13 places later, here is what we found. We did not expect a town the census officially counts at 0. Its last cemetery boxed in on 3 sides by a chemical plant. We did not expect a swamp community still down there, buried under 12 feet of silt. We did not expect the ground to simply open in 2012 and swallow a town whole. And we did not expect the first French settlement on the whole river to have vanished so completely that not even its graves survive. But the one that made this feel necessary is number 1. A single October night in 1893. Stay with us. This is what we do here. Follow the threads other people drop. Subscribe if that sounds like something you want more of. Today, we are counting down 13 Louisiana ghost towns that time completely forgot. Number 13 is Waterloo in Pointe Coupee Parish, on the west bank of the Mississippi, just east of New Roads. Around 1820, it grew into a cotton and sugar port, prosperous enough to ring itself with 2 levees. A big state-maintained one in the rear, a small one the community built itself at the river's edge. 2 walls against the water. In 1884, both broke at once, and the river walked straight through the town. It took the smaller communities downriver with it, Anchor and Cook's Landing. What the flood left standing, arsonists finished in the 1890s. Between the water and the fire, Waterloo was erased so completely that nothing stands there today. The families moved a few miles west to New Roads and did not look back. Then there is the Cannonball. A parish memoir records one dug up at Waterloo, 28 feet down. That is how deep the river folded the town under. People living on the site now still turn up pieces of it in their yards. A town you find by accident with a shovel. Number 12, Taft, once returned a population of 0. That was the 2000 census, the first time anyone drew a line around it. St. Charles Parish, West Bank, deep in the industrial corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. In 1905, Taft had a post office and around 700 people. It was named, reportedly, for the brother of a sitting president, a man with lumber interests in the area. Then the chemical plants arrived and bought the town parcel by parcel. The church pulled up and moved to Hahnville in the 60s. The post office closed in 1967. By 1977, 10 homes and 36 people were left. What remains now is a single working cemetery, hemmed in on 3 sides by a Dow complex, with a nuclear station for a neighbor. And then there is the tree. Taft was home to the Lockbro live oak, once among the largest ever measured, roughly 100 feet tall, nearly 400 years old. It died in the 1960s of industrial pollution. The town outlived the oak, but not by much. Number 11 is the exception on this list, the ghost town that kept its body. Longleaf in the pine woods of Rapides Parish was a company sawmill town built in 1892 by Crowell and Spencer, and named for the longleaf pine feeding the mill. Most Louisiana mill towns worked on a simple, brutal logic. Cut the forest, exhaust it in a decade, move on, and let the town die. The Crowells did something unusual. They replanted as they cut, which let the mill keep running long after most of the big Louisiana mills had gone silent. During the war, the durable heartwood they cut went into Andrew Higgins's landing boats. Then, on Valentine's Day 1969, demand collapsed and the owners closed the mill without ceremony. Boys go home, we're closing. Because the place was left to the vines rather than the wrecking ball, it survived nearly whole, and in the 90s, it became the Southern Forest Heritage Museum, a full steam-powered mill, a roundhouse of old locomotives, a 1937 rail car that still runs a loop. And the abruptness left something behind. There are spots in the sawmill where a worker's lunch pail is still sitting where he set it down. 50-odd years, and nobody came back for it. Which brings us back to number 10, the sign that started all of this. Ruddick sat on a thin isthmus in the Manchac Swamp between Lake Maurepas and Lake Pontchartrain. William Burton and a man named C.H. Ruddick founded a cypress company there in 1892, and because the town lived over black water, they built it for the water. Houses on pilings, 2 stories tall, with wooden sidewalks running over the muck between them. By 1910, about 700 people lived up on those stilts. Then, on the night of September 29, 1915, a Category 4 hurricane drove a surge across the low ground and shook the wooden town apart in hours. 58 people died across Ruddick and neighboring Frenier. Nobody rebuilt. Here is the detail that stopped us. More than a century later, Ruddick is still a signed exit on Interstate 55, Exit 7, to a town that has not existed since 1915. The exit leads to a boat launch and nothing else. The pilings are still out in the swamp. A retired officer named Wayne Norwood has spent decades diving that water for what is left of the town, and he keeps his finds in a museum in Ponchatoula, an exit to nowhere maintained by the state. Number 9, you cannot visit because it is under your feet. Bayou Chêne was a real town. Church, school, store, a post office that opened in 1858, built on a natural levee deep inside the Atchafalaya Basin, 40 miles north of Morgan City. Around 500 people lived there in the early 1920s. Swampers, trappers, moss pickers, families who had been there for generations, making a living entirely off the cypress and the fish and the Spanish moss. The only way in or out was by boat. Then came the Great Flood of 1927. To save New Orleans, engineers turned the whole basin into an official floodway and walled it off. And Bayou Chêne ended up on the wrong side of the levees. Every high water year raised the mud a little higher. A priest remembered the church floor rippling like the surface of a lake. The post office closed in 1952, and the last families carried their houses out on barges, plank by plank, and rebuilt in New Iberia and St. Martinville and Breaux Bridge. Here is the part that stopped us cold. To reach any trace of Bayou Chêne today, you would have to dig down through more than 10 feet of silt. The name lives on, now only, on a flood control structure finished in 2022. The town is still there. It is just underneath everything. Here is the one that stopped us at number 8. La Balise was the first French settlement at the very mouth of the Mississippi, a fort thrown up on Delta mud in 1699 to control who went up the river to New Orleans. By 1721, the French had built a 62-foot wooden pyramid there, a sea mark to guide ships in off the Gulf. It was a town of river pilots, and it was miserable. When the architect who helped design the U.S. Capitol passed through in 1819, he called it one of the most wretched villages in the country. The problem was hurricanes. La Balise was washed away in 1740, rebuilt on a brand new island that had just risen from the sea, wrecked again in 1778, moved, wrecked again. France and Spain kept rebuilding it anyway, because whoever held the river's mouth held New Orleans. The storms of 1860 finally broke them, and the pilots moved 5 miles upriver to a place called Pilot Town. By 1921, a New Orleans paper called the Old Site the wickedest town and farthest outpost of Louisiana, smothered under Delta slime. Today, even the tombs are gone. And Pilot Town, the town they fled to, lost its last permanent residents to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. 300 years of empire fought the river for that spot. The river won, and then it won again. Number 7 is the town next door to Ruddick, and it arrives with a legend attached. So, let us handle the legend carefully. Frenier began as a German farming settlement in the Manchac Swamp, a place called Schlesser, shipping cabbage and sauerkraut down the Illinois Central Railroad to New Orleans. Living there was a woman named Julia Brown. The stories call her a voodoo priestess who cursed the town. The record calls her something quieter and more real, a healer and midwife, a literate landowner, the person a town with no doctor relied on. In her last years, she felt taken for granted, and she would sit on her porch with a guitar, singing a song she made up, that one day she would die and take everything with her. She died on September 29, 1915. That same day, a Category 4 hurricane erased Frenier. 25 people were killed when the depot they sheltered in collapsed. Region-wide, the storm killed around 275. A newspaper account from that week describes her funeral scattering as the storm came in. Mourners fleeing, the body left behind, the casket never found. The curse is folklore, most of it invented decades later, and historians have pushed back hard on the way it turned a respected black midwife into a villain. What is true is stranger and sadder. A woman sang about the end, and the sky agreed with her on the day they buried her. Number 6 is where the list stops being quaint. Bayou Corne was a quiet Cajun fishing community in Assumption Parish, near Napoleonville. Bayou country settled by Acadians more than 200 years ago. In the summer of 2012, the bayou started to bubble. Then, the ground began to shake. For 2 months, nobody could say why. On August 3rd, they found out. A little over a mile down, the wall of an underground salt cavern gave way. The cavern belonged to a company mining brine from the Napoleonville salt dome, and it had been carved too close to the dome's outer edge. When the company tried to expand it, it failed a pressure test, and the well was plugged in 2011. The next summer, it collapsed anyway. Sand and rock rushed into the void, and the surface fell into a sinkhole that opened in the swamp, belching diesel. The governor declared a state of emergency. Around 350 people were told to leave. The hole did not stop. It grew until it covered about 35 acres, big enough to drop the roof of the Superdome into 4 times over, swallowing whole cypress trees and burping oil for months, like something alive under the water. In 2018, a judge found the companies had ignored warnings about that cavern going back to the 1970s, putting economics over safety. The evacuation lifted in 2016. The 2020 census found 32 people still there. Most took the buyout and left grass-covered slabs where their houses stood. The bayou looks almost peaceful now. That is the unsettling part. It looks like any other lake. If you are enjoying following this rabbit hole with us, drop a like. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. And if any of these places ring a bell, and if you have driven past one or grew up near one, tell us in the comments. Our viewers have stood in some of these spots. We read all of it. Number 5 was, for a moment, one of the most modern towns in the South. Fullerton sat in the pine country of Vernon Parish, built around a single ambition, the largest pine sawmill west of the Mississippi. In 1906, a lumberman named Samuel Fullerton bought roughly 106,000 acres of virgin longleaf pine, $6 million of timber, and put up a mill of steel and concrete to cut it. The town that grew around it had electricity, indoor plumbing, a swimming pool, a hotel, a hospital, a theater, schools, and churches. Somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people lived there. It was built of concrete on purpose to feel permanent. It was not. The mill ran day and night and cut through the forest with no plan to replant. On May 6, 1927, they cut the last log. The whistle blew, the mill went quiet, and the town emptied out. When the photographer Dorothea Lange came through in 1937 for the Farm Security Administration, she found it already a ruin, and the ruins are the point. Walk the trail in the Kisatchie National Forest today, and you will find more than 10 concrete footings, 5 feet tall, standing in the trees, the bones of the biggest mill in the region, holding up nothing. Rangers set controlled burns to keep the forest from finishing the job. Once a year, in October, people come back for a sawmill day on the same ground. A city built to last, undone by the thing it was built to cut. Number 4 is a town that people built for themselves and then lost. In the 1870s, people freed from a plantation near Plaquemine founded Morrisonville on the west bank of the Mississippi. They raised the Nazarene Baptist Church in 1889, named it after Reverend Robert Morrison, and made a community that held together for 100 years. In 1958, the Dow Chemical Company bought the plantation land next door and built a plant making vinyl chloride. Over the next 30 years, the plant grew toward the town. By the 1980s, the community's groundwater was contaminated, and life in the plant's shadow had taken on a specific, telling shape. The residents had special radios installed in their homes to warn them when there was a chemical emergency. In 1989, Dow bought the whole town and moved everyone out into two new subdivisions, Morrisonville Estates and Morrisonville Acres. Today, the site is inside the Dow complex, off limits. All that is left of Morrisonville is its cemeteries and a historical marker. And it was not the only one. This stretch of river, the 80 miles they call Cancer Alley, holds several towns first built by freed slaves and later bought out by industry. Revelatown, Sunrise, Diamond at Norco, Mossville. A people freed themselves onto that land. A century later, they were paid to leave it. Number 3 stood in the middle of a battlefield, which is exactly why it is gone. Around 1870, a New Orleans grocer named Jean-Pierre Fazend, a free man of color, took a strip of land he had inherited and cut it into lots for freed slaves. The people who lived there called it the village. One street, about 30 houses, general stores, a one-room school that ran grades 1 through 8, mutual aid societies, and the Battleground Baptist Church. It had one problem. It sat squarely between the two halves of what was becoming a national park, the field where the Battle of New Orleans was fought, and the National Cemetery beside it. As the 150th anniversary approached, the Park Service wanted the land to join the two. The residents refused to sell, so Congress authorized taking it. The road was closed in November 1964, the houses were down by 1966, and more than 50 families were scattered, most into the lower 9th Ward. They were paid about $6,000 each when a new house cost $16,000. For decades, the field held nothing but grass and a quiet Park Service sign. And then someone noticed the flowers. Dark purple irises and white African lilies still come up every spring in straight rows, exactly where the front yards used to be, planted by people who were told to leave, possibly descended from plants carried over by enslaved Africans, blooming now for a town that is no longer there. A battlefield remembers a battle. The flowers remember the people. Number 2 is not a town that time forgot. It is a town disappearing right now. Isle de Jean Charles is a narrow ridge of land in the coastal bayous of Terrebonne Parish. The Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw have lived there since the 1830s, when their ancestors moved out to that remote island, partly to stay ahead of Indian removal. For over a century, it sustained them. Fishing, trapping, farming. Then, the land started to go. Since 1955, the island has lost 98% of itself. It was more than 22,000 acres, about half the size of Washington, D.C. It is now around 320 acres, roughly half the size of the National Mall. Rising seas did part of it. So did the oil and gas canals cut through the marsh, and the levees that stopped the Mississippi from resupplying the delta with sediment. Salt water killed the oaks. Hurricanes battered the single road on and off the island, the one that floods when the weather turns. The people who could leave did. From around 300 residents down to about 60. In 2016, the state spent $48 million federal dollars to move the community inland to a place called the New Isle, 40 miles north. The first time this country funded the relocation of an entire town for climate. It has not gone smoothly, and for the people who lived there, it was never a victory. They did not want a new island. They wanted the one the water is taking. Start on Louisiana Highway 1, near Grand Isle, at a small cemetery beside the road. The wind comes off the Gulf and moves through the marsh grass. The brick tombs are cracked and leaning, and the ground beneath them is slowly going down into the water. There is a monument here, and not much else. This is all that is left of Chênière Caminada. In 1893, this was not a graveyard. It was a village of around 1,500 people. French-speaking Creoles, Acadians, Italians, Germans, on a warm coastal ridge with orange groves and oyster beds, sending shrimp and oysters to the restaurants of New Orleans. It took its name from a Spanish planter, It had just built a new schoolhouse. It had a post office. These were people who read the weather off the water for a living. The storm that came on the night of October 1st, 1893, they did not see coming. Late that day, the birds went inland. The cattle followed. Then, the Gulf came over the island. It was an unnamed hurricane, a Category 4, winds around 130 miles an hour, pushing a wall of water some 16 to 18 feet high. It hit a village of low wooden houses in the dark. By morning, 779 of the 1,471 people who lived there were dead, nearly half the town. Of roughly 450 homes, 4 were left standing. In one collapsed house, 62 people survived under a single piece of the roof. Across the region, the storm killed around 2,000 people. It remains the deadliest hurricane in Louisiana history. A few survivors tried to rebuild on that spit of sand. Later storms took what they managed. The one thing that outlived the village belongs to literature. A writer named Kate Chopin, who spent her summers on neighboring Grand Isle, wrote a short story called At Chênière Caminada in the days right after the storm, and set part of her novel, The Awakening, on these same shores. So the town became a graveyard, and the graveyard is going too. Every year, the tombs settle a little deeper into the marsh, and the water moves a little closer. The descendants still come, on the anniversaries, to a cemetery that is quietly leaving. The people here read the water for a living. In the end, the water read them. And that is where we will leave it. A name at the edge of the Gulf, going under, remembered by a cemetery that is itself disappearing. There are more threads, there always are. Louisiana keeps most of its history in the margins, just off the highway. Our favorite is Bayou Chêne, because a whole town sitting under 12 feet of mud is the kind of thing that stays with you. Which one surprised you most, and which thread should we pull next? Subscribe, and we will keep following them.